Hello, and welcome back to Let's Discuss Emotion for Training because it's awesome, or something like that. It's a working title, don't pay too much attention to it. Anyway, the motion that we have today is that this House believes that states should create data centers as a form of public good. Now, this was a motion that I thought of when I was reading an article in The Economist that talked about how data centers are basically taking over our lives and are super important, and that there are a few major players for these data centers. So let's explore this topic, right? So the first thing we're going to do is talk about some debate, definition, and setup stuff, which is the starting point of most debates. And what you should do is think about what are the key words, the key topics, the key phrases that you need to define. So one obvious one is going to be data centers. The other one would be maybe how you're going to fund or to create them, and maybe talking about what a public good actually is and how do you define those things. Now, there's going to be a lot of ambiguity here. There'll be a scale, right? For example, with things like how you're going to fund them, you can have a very high level of funding and you fund and control everything. You can have public private partnerships, that are somewhere over there, maybe in the scale of how intense the state involvement is, or you can have very minimal state involvement. The motion actually says create, not really fund. And a very minimal state involvement would be states just give permission, right? And that's too soft. States funding and nationalizing and running and owning might be too hard. But depending where exactly the scale, on the scale rather, you want to put the motion or the debate, will really depend on what you're trying to do with the debate, right? So let's take a step back and think about why this debate and why this debate is important. And at this point, you should do, if you haven't done already, a little bit of brainstorming about the debate, right? Create a little storm and think about different things, why this debate is actually happening and why this is an issue. And I've already done this, so I'm going to skip on to this part. And if I could put it in one sentence, and this is also useful, after your brainstorming, if you can narrow it down, and if you can't narrow it to one sentence, that's fine, but it's helpful if you can, because it also becomes a sentence that you can use in the debate, a bit of a rallying cry. And for me, this is that one sentence, right? I think that modern businesses need data centers. They absolutely need them to hold data, to run their business, to manage things if they're going to expand. Because everything, there's an IT and online component to everything, so you need a data center. And these data centers are really expensive and controlled by a few key players, right? So this is my problem statement. And if you look at this problem statement, now regardless of whether you agree or disagree with this problem statement, but assuming this is the problem statement, from here you should be able to see some arguments. You should be able to see also some limitations and restrictions around the debate, right? So this identifying the problem is a really key part and something that you really need to get to at the start before you go into definitions. Now, assuming that this is the problem statement, I'm zooming out a little bit there, you can see that from here we can draw some parallels to some arguments, right? So if it is expensive and businesses need it, then not having access to this or having charged high access to this has an impact on the development and growth of a country. And if they're controlled by a few key players, there's an impact on equity, so they decide who has access to that. There's also an impact on security, right? Maybe stability. If you are dependent on Amazon or dependent on Azure or a few others to provide your data, right? From a business perspective, but also from a government perspective. Because if you think about it, governments have a lot of stuff in the cloud. Very ugly looking cloud. But they have things like, government data. They have things like individual citizen data. So when they do a census and stuff, for example, all that information is stored somewhere. There's police data, there's health data. So there's a lot of data now, and ever increasing amounts of data that is stored in the cloud, and that cloud is run by private providers, right? Increasingly, there may be some that's run by the government, but a lot of that expertise is locked up in government providers. So this is the problem, this is the context of the debate. That takes us back to our definition, right? Because remember, we still haven't really defined the debate. There we are in terms of our definition. Now, what I think is a really important way to approach any debate is think about the principle that you are defending, right? That's this one over here. And to think about then a good parallel that helps you explain this principle and explains this case, right? So in this debate, the principle that we're defending, I think, are these, right? The principle here is access, ensuring that people have good access to this data center, to these things that are really, really important, to ensure security of that data rather than putting it in the hands of private providers, and ensuring that the government has control over these things, and that control is important, right? So let's say these are my principles. You can come up with a few more principles, but I think in this debate these things are key. And if those are your principles, you need to ensure that the definition can uphold those principles, however you choose to define the debate, right? And that's what the debate is about. And when I'm defining the debate, I would say these are the keywords in the debate. This is what we're trying to ensure from the government side. We're trying to ensure access. We're trying to ensure access. We're trying to ensure security. We're trying to ensure that we have control over data that's really, really important to us. Okay, and you try to define these things as best as you can. And one way to do that and to help you is to find a good parallel. Now, in many, many, many debates, every time a government is doing something, there's something else that that government or business or individual has done that is very similar to what they're trying to do now, right? And in this debate, I think these are some things that are pretty similar. When a government builds roads, or governments build ports, or government builds airports, all of these things tend to be government funded, right? At least initially, because they are large infrastructure that it's difficult and too expensive for private providers to do on their own or for individuals to do, and it's really, really important to a country. Without roads, for example, you won't be able to connect different businesses to sell stuff, right, to buy and sell. And similarly, without ports, ships and people can't come in, and you can't sell stuff overseas and internationally. And with airports and with many other different things that are critical infrastructure for the entire country. So if you can position data centers as something that is similar to this, something that provides crucial infrastructure for the nation to develop, then it makes your arguments even more applicable, right? Also, there's a little note here. If you think about it, these are all things that are often government funded but also privately managed, right? So this gives you an idea of how you can make this argument work. This is an idea for further arguments. Think about the same arguments we have to support the existence of roads or the existence of airports or terminals are similar arguments that you can use to support creation of data centers. Okay, so it's a little bit brief and I've rushed through somewhat, but I hope by this stage you should have a good understanding of what the problem is in the debate, the problem that you're trying to solve, and what is the key principle that you're trying to defend, a good parallel that you can use to explain and to control the debate, right? So if you do these things well, you should have a good foundation to run the debate. So now we look at what the argument should be, and I'll very briefly run through what I think are some good arguments you can use in support of this debate and some good arguments you can use in opposition. Okay, the first argument I think you should run, and this is a critical part of the debate, is that data centers are special. Special like roads and stuff, etc. Right? So special in the sense as in fundamental for development. So they connect different people together, and without data centers, countries can't develop. They're really, really expensive and hard for individuals to set up on their own. So you're beholden to people who have lots of capital or international players. And if you think about it even more, data centers are special like roads and stuff, but also different because they are international. You can use Google's data centers, you can use Amazon's data centers, but you can't use international roads. And that can be a positive thing in a way, because having large data centers that anybody can use can be a form of aid, right? And America, it's harder for a big country to come to another country and build roads, although they can. But if the big countries can create data centers that are accessible by poorer countries. So this can be an argument for or against, but what I'm highlighting here is that there are a few things that are special and different about data centers. And from the government side, you really want to show that there are things that are really, really big, things that are really, really important and linked in to business, but also linked in to the government, right? And it'll be good to emphasize the notion of data and why this data is really, really important. Okay. The second thing I think you can run is show how it is helped the growth of a nation. And this is the link to the economic arguments, right? So all growth now in the modern economy, discuss the modern economy, needs data centers, and what happens if a government has if the government has control. So if government has control, government can create incentives, government can lower the barrier to entry, right? Government can connect different businesses. Government can do all these different things that help businesses get on to the web and get onto the modern industry and really, really build and really, really grow, right? So again, thinking a lot like how roads or other infrastructure help, show how, because data centers are special in this sense, if we have them, it will help the country grow, and why this growth is really important, and the type of nation that you're talking about. So obviously, this argument is helped if it is if it's a developing country, perhaps, because the data center, the IT industry is not a debate about America. Could be a debate about Europe, but I think it's more of a tilt towards debates of countries that are perhaps developing. Right? It could work both ways. You think about it and think about how that strategy may help you. The third argument, and this is slightly different, is the argument around security. And here you draw a connection from data and how a lot of that data can be sensitive, and how this data is managed, owned, controlled by people overseas, right? And ownership is an important, interesting idea. You can own the data and the data belongs to you, but you don't actually hold it. So who actually owns that data, even if it's your data, right? This is why many governments have private data centers, but even then, those data centers tend to be really they run out of space, but to manage them, right? There's an ever increasing amount of data. So if you have a 2-level system, for example, where governments have private data centers and then businesses use, once provided. So government data centers are ones that governments create their own data centers for government data, and businesses use other data centers that are run privately, right? And this is the kind of status quo in some places, because the American government is not going to put their data onto Amazon's servers, but many other countries can't really afford to do that, number one. But number two, this is ever increasing and growing. So governments need to do a lot of this anyway, but also the data here still belongs to private citizens, right? Who the government needs to take care of, And the data here is also still very important, right? So if a foreign country hacked a data center that held business data of the government citizens, it's not like the government's not going to care because their citizens are still harmed, right? It's like if the citizens of a particular country were held hostage in another country, and even if they weren't representing the state officially, that state still cares, right? So there's some really interesting nuances here around data and what that data means, how that data is managed, and how that data is protected, and who has ownership of that data. And from the government side of the debate, you argue that it's better for the government to have more ownership and more control over this data and these data centers. What would you do from the opposition end of the debate? So from the opposition end of the debate, we start with the argument around private industry. So this is a classic sort of, when one side's arguing for government involvement, the other side's natural opposition is private, right? Rely on these common classic frames. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, it's a bad idea to keep reinventing the wheel. If the other side's talking about government, talk about private. Say private will do a better job because they have more money, they're better positioned. Competition is good. When the government doesn't have competition, it does stupid things. When private companies compete, they can lower prices, create better access, and make a nicer smelling world. And talk about technology. All the technology, the cutting edge technology, is all held by the private guys. So let the private guys do that and do a fantastic job. Right? So that's the first argument and the major theme from the opposition team, that is relying on the government, on the private industry. The opposition also doesn't really trust the government. They say the government in the status quo already has a lot of power, right? They have an army, they have police, they have lots of the power to make legislation, and so on. Now they have the power to control all your data. And now this is not they're forcing you to put it there, but if there's an incentive to do so, then they will pool all the data together in a large place, because they want to encourage business, they want to encourage everybody to put the data in one place. So this gives the government too much power which you think they may not manage properly here anyway. So it's dangerous, but also power that they could abuse. Now, you can, on opposition in the legislation point here, talk about the role of the government, right? So the government, and this should be in your setup, that the government plays the role of a referee, and the government should create guidelines and standards to ensure that private industry doesn't abuse the power that private industry has. But there's nothing that stops government from abusing the power that government has, other than other governments, but that often doesn't work very well, right? So that's the position that you can take in government and in opposition. And in opposition, you can run some of these points stronger by showing competition is growing, prices are reducing, in response to some of the arguments that the government side may be making. The third argument that you can make here, and this is an interesting one, is if the government takes this line, it may be restricting this approach and technology. Right? Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, they're overplaying the importance of data centers. If they invest billions into creating many, many data centers, then they are beholden to that approach to storing data, or that approach to that technology, right? Or else we don't know where they might go. We could have a distributed model of storing data, or a far more compressed model of storing data, or a model which looks at data in a completely different way that reduces our reliance on data centers, right? Because that's the next bottleneck. If we are really producing this much data, we can't keep creating data centers all around the world and putting more and more data in it, and that's just not sustainable. But if governments put all this money behind this model, then they become committed to it, right? And there's a parallel also with roads and ports, and this kind of antiquated approaches. Governments, there are ways now to leapfrog the technology and leapfrog the development cycles. Some countries are finding building roads is not the most effective way to spend money. They use drones to move critical things between roads, or different types of transportation architecture that don't rely on building these roads, right? And there are other arguments that you can run, obviously, related to that. Arguments to do with the harm to the environment from data centers, where else you can spend the money better, etc., depending on the context when the debate is set, and so on and so forth, right? But basically, this should be more than enough to kind of structure and fold the debate, and give you a grip on the debate, right? So hopefully, this will give you a good idea on how to run the debate, in terms of the definition, the setup, the principle that you need to defend, and the problem, right? And we hope that this is not what you get from this little video is not just how to run this one debate, but a general approach to how you prepare cases for debates, or how you approach any debate that is new. Think about why you're doing that debate, right? And then think about the problem, and try to scope out that problem a little more, and that should give you an idea of some of the arguments you can run. And from there, think about the principle you're defending, and think about perils. Every time the government or a business or somebody is asked to do something, there is definitely a peril, I promise you. And then go to the pro and the con, okay? And flesh out your arguments from there. And what I've done here is hopefully will give you a good basis for some arguments, but I know because you're super smart people, you're going to come up with more. The last thing I'm going to say is, if you liked that video and you liked that discussion, give us some love at Debate Good. What we're trying to do at Debate Good is help people debate good and do other things good too, because good things are important for the world today. So that's it, my friends. Hope you had a good time. Enjoy. Goodbye.